pjnet.tv. It is Tuesday night, 9 p.m. on the East Coast, and we have a special guest that you will want to hear from, and you'll want to know more about it. So our bumper's running, we are recording, streaming all over the place, and we will start a countdown to Studio 12. Well, good evening and welcome to pjnet.tv. Every night I enjoy and look forward to our program and sharing this time with you. But tonight I enjoy it even more so for a different reason. We are very blessed to have Dr. Craig Van Buseck standing by. And he has appeared on our program one time prior with his book, I Am Cyrus. But he has a new book coming out, and we are going to spend some time getting to know not only the book, but the author and also the subject of the book. And here is Dr. Craig Van Buseck himself. Good evening, Dr. Buseck. How are you tonight?
I'm very well, Mark. How are you?
Well, we will not get everything we would like to in the next 20 minutes, but we're going to have some fun. Folks, if you ever are on a game show and ask a trivia question concerning the history of the Civil War, tonight's program may be worth quite a bit of money to you. So let's do some trivia. Your book, Victor, it's actually the late years of Ulysses S Grant, our 18th president, the general that led the Union Army in the Civil War to victory. What was Ulysses S. Grant's middle name?
The quote that he said to his wife was, "I don't have a middle name." And the reason is that Grant's father was a man named Jesse Grant, who was an entrepreneur, and he had his own tannery when Grant was a child. Grant could not stand the smell of it, and he didn't like all the gore associated with it. So Grant did not want to follow in his father's footsteps. So Jesse had to figure out something to help his son to have a career. And Jesse was very much involved in Whig politics at the time, and he found out through his political connections that the local boy who had been sent to West Point with the blessing of the community had washed out. And that can happen. West Point was and still is extremely difficult curriculum. A lot of difficulty with regard to engineering and mathematics. And so a lot of students will wash out from West Point then and now. And so this looked like an opportunity. So Jesse Grant put together an application without talking to his son about this, and tried to get Ulysses into West Point. And he had to go through his congressman, who used to be a friend, but they had split over the issue of slavery. Jesse was an ardent abolitionist, and this congressman was not as strong as Jesse thought he should be. And so Jesse tried to go around and send the application directly to the War Department, but they sent it back saying you have to go through the right channels, which means you're a local congressman. So he, kind of dragged his feet and sent the application to the congressman. Well, it arrived, and this gentleman's name was Congressman Thomas Hamer. And the application arrived on the very last day of his term. He was leaving office. And so he got this letter and looked at it and thought, oh man, I don't have time for this. But he knew he needed to do it to save face in the local community because Jesse Grant was kind of a bigwig in the local politics. And so he quickly put together his signature. And one of the things that was required was the complete name of the student who was going to go to West Point. Well, everybody called the young boy, the child of Hannah and Jesse Grant, they all called him Ulysses. And so he thought his name was Ulysses. And he didn't know what the middle name was, but he had to have a middle name. And so he wrote in the mother's maiden name, which was Simpson, and then put Grant. So he sent the application with his endorsement to West Point under the name Ulysses S Grant. So when Ulysses, who his first name actually was Hiram, so his middle name was Ulysses. So it was Hiram Ulysses Grant. So when Hiram Ulysses Grant appeared at West Point and he said, Hiram Grant here checking in, and they said, we don't have any Hiram Grant. We only have a Ulysses Simpson Grant. And he said, well, that's not my name. My name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. And they basically said, listen, you either are going to come here as Ulysses Simpson Grant or Ulysses S Grant, or you're not going to be enrolled in West Point. And so Ulysses said, all right, I will now be Ulysses Simpson Grant or Ulysses S Grant. And so they put his name up on the bulletin board as a new student as U.S. Grant. So the older cadets all thought that was hysterical, that U.S. Grant was going to be a part of their school. So they first called him Uncle Sam Grant, and then it was shortened to Sam Grant. And Sam Grant was his nickname for the rest of his life. But his real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, which the change in the initials was actually a good thing because Hiram Ulysses Grant is H-U-G, and it would be not good to be in the Army with the initials of Hug. So U.S. Grant worked much better for him. And of course, we know that, at Fort Donelson, when he told Buckner that he would only accept unconditional surrender from him, that then he became known in the press as Unconditional Surrender Grant. So he had all kinds of names. But even though it wasn't legal, it wasn't his birth name, after West Point, he was always U.S. Grant.
West Point doesn't make mistakes. You must be mistaken. You don't know your own name. And interesting twist of history. Now, Grant was not the ideal premier head of the class guy at West Point. He graduated pretty much dead center.
Yes, but again, I think it's important it's interesting how some historians will tell certain parts of Grant's story, but only tell the negative part or the part that is kind of a little bit of the final information, but not the full information. So the full information is that, yes, he did graduate 22nd in his class, which was right in the middle of his graduating class. What is not told is that there were 76 cadets that started in the program. Mm-hmm. So in reality, of the cadets that began the program, mm-hmm. he would have graduated in the top third of mm-hmm. his class. Mm-hmm. He was excellent in mathematics. He was excellent in art. And he was such a great horseman that in their graduation, the horse master got the most fractious horse out of the barn, this big monster horse. And in front of all the other cadets, all the parents, all the faculty, and the local people who came for the graduation, he said, "Grant, front and center." So Grant comes up and he gets on this fractious horse and he goes to the far end of the parade grounds. And this master, the horse teacher, set the bar over 6 feet tall. And he said, "Move forward, Grant." And so Grant took off from the far end of the parade grounds. And those observers, there's actually a cadet who graduated 2 or 3 years behind Grant that was there. And he gave a description of that event. And he said it was as if Grant was welded onto the horse, like they were one. And he went easily over that 6+ foot jump. And that record stood for the next 20 years. Mm-hmm. Ironically, because of Grant's grades, and we were talking earlier before the show about his demerits, because of the number of his demerits and his standing at 22nd, the Army, in its wisdom, put him into the infantry rather than putting him into the cavalry, even though he was the best horseman in the whole class.
His ambition was to lead the cavalry.
He wanted to be in the cavalry, yeah. Mm-hmm. But it actually worked out for everyone's benefit because eventually Grant worked his way up to become quartermaster during the Mexican War, a position that trained him very well for becoming a general and then lieutenant general of all the armies in the end. And the the quartermasters who would receive Grant's orders when he was general during the Civil War were amazed at his thorough orders because he knew how to do it, and he knew what he wanted, and he knew what they needed. And so Grant and his top quartermaster general, Rufus Ingalls, which was one of Grant's roommates at West Point, they ran a show, especially during the siege of Petersburg, that was truly a remarkable thing. I mean, they built a hospital, they built a bakery, they built a railroad that went right to the front lines. They literally had these cannons, huge cannons, on railroad cars, and it was the first time ever that they did that, so they could move the railroad car where they wanted, build tracks where they wanted, and then lob shells into Petersburg. So it's a remarkable thing, yeah. So yes, he was in the middle of his class, but he was actually in the top third of the original students.
Your book is not a documentary per se on the life of General Grant. It is more focused on his battles after he left the public eye.
Yeah, and that's why the subtitle is The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. This book focuses on the final 2 to 3 years of his life. After he left the presidency, they didn't have a pension for presidents actually until Harry S. Truman, the subject of my earlier book, I Am Cyrus. And so Grant had no retirement because he had to give up his retirement when he left the army to become president. I don't know why. I still haven't figured out why that was the case, but that was the case. And so after he had actually, his son was pretty sharp. He was his chief of staff, and the son's name was Ulysses Jr. Everybody called him Buck. And his son had made some very wise investments, and one of them on behalf of the president, and one of them was in the Comstock silver mine. And so Grant had this big chunk of money when he first got out of the White House, and he and Julia had been basically serving their country for the last 20 plus years, and they were looking forward to a nice vacation. So they spent 2 years traveling the world and meeting with all these heads of states and seeing the Great Wall of China and walking the Via Dolorosa and meeting with the Pope and speaking with Otto von Bismarck in Berlin and so on. But then the money started to run out, and so Grant had to find a job. He ran for a third term, but his heart really wasn't in it, and Garfield ended up winning. So Grant's looking for work, and his son, by this point, had started an investment firm with a business partner whose name was Ferdinand Ward, and they called him, at the time, the young Napoleon of Wall Street. Everybody thought he was a wizard because he was making all this incredible money for everyone who had invested in their firm. So the firm was called Grant and Ward, and they went to Ulysses and said, "Why don't you join us in the firm?" And he said, "I don't know anything about investing." And they said, "No, your job is to attract all your wealthy friends and political buddies and generals, and we will sell them on the investments." And he said, "Oh, I could do that." So he got into this business partnership and was making money hand over fist for 2 years, and was going to all the soirees and the wonderful parties and playing poker with J.P. Morgan and Vanderbilt and all the robber barons of the time, and thought he was worth more than $1 million. Well, the problem was that this Ferdinand Ward character was operating a giant Ponzi scheme the whole time. And so nothing was being invested. It was just, as things came in, he would send out these fake checks. Well, they weren't fake, they were real, but they were using the money that was being invested. Right. And so eventually that house of cards is going to collapse, and it did after 2 years. And so Grant went from thinking he was worth $2 million or $1 million to being worth exactly $80. And so they had to get rid of all their servants. They had to look at trying to sell off their properties. They had no money. And so he started to write some articles for a magazine that would be like, Newsweek or Life magazine. It was called the Century magazine. He was writing about his battles. And it was so well received that they said, "Well, why don't you write your memoirs?" And he thought, well, that's an idea. He didn't really want to do it. But then he was at his summer cottage in New Jersey, Long Branch, New Jersey, and he bit into a peach and he cried out in pain, "Ah, I think there was an insect in that peach that stung my throat. And he was in terrible pain, and the pain wouldn't go away. And so after about 2 or 3 months, he finally went to see a doctor. The doctor looked down his throat and knew right away, this is throat cancer, incurable throat cancer. So now he has no money and he's dying of throat cancer. So he knows that he needs to write his memoirs in order to have money for his wife to live on after he dies. And he had worked with, or one of his best friends was Mark Twain. And Twain had started his own publishing company and had actually asked Grant to write his memoirs 2 years earlier. But at the time, Grant thought he had all this money, so he wasn't interested. Now he was very interested. And so Twain heard the rumor that he might be writing his memoirs for this other company. And he came to Grant and said, "Hey, I asked you first." And after a long investigation, Grant finally said, okay. And he gave the publishing contract to Mark Twain, which was a great thing because Twain knew how to sell books. And so Grant spent then the rest of that last year every day in tremendous pain writing his memoirs on a yellow legal pad by hand. And when he got too weak to do that, they hired a stenographer who wrote every day that Grant could. Now, there were some days he was too sick and too ill to write, but most days he wrote something or he edited. And he finished the book 4 days before he died. And he died, and his funeral in New York City was the largest funeral in American history, with more than 1.5 million people that came out for the funeral. Mark Twain put the book out only a few months later, and it ended up making for his wife, for Julia Grant, $450,000 in the 1800s, which is equivalent to $10 million today. So in all of that, Grant magnificently triumphed.
The image, well, first of all, history that far back for many is unknown, unfortunately. But regardless, it seems as history tends to mythify the characters. He's on our $50 bill. He's known as the 18th president. He's known as the victor in the battle to reunify. But those are the obvious on the surface points. But you know more about Grant than that. You know the man, the leader, the family man, the character, and the integrity of him at his very core.
Yes, and Grant is, in my opinion, someone who can be a role model for us today. Many of the same things that we're struggling with today, with racial relations and civil rights, with things that are happening, even with regard to immigration and so forth. All of these things were not only major issues during Grant's time, but they broke out into a civil war. And the thing that most people don't recognize, you were talking about Grant's character and his background. He married into a slave-owning family. The Dents of St. Louis had a huge plantation with several slaves. I think they had 20 slaves on this plantation. And so for a wedding present, Grant's wife received, I think, 3 slaves. And then later, after Grant left the Army because of his alcoholism, which is another issue that he had to overcome, he was given another slave himself, a male slave. And he worked with that male slave on the farm that, his father-in-law had given him several acres that he worked as a farmer. And so people don't realize that, yes, in the end, he came around and he adopted and embraced Abraham Lincoln's philosophies and his policies. But before the war, he was a slave owner. But what happened is that there was so much vitriol about the slave issue. It was ripping the country apart. And Grant was a Northerner. His father had been, as I said, a very strong abolitionist. So Grant grew up in an abolitionist home. Now he's living in a slave home. And he's seeing the friends that he's made over the last 20 years, they're all starting to pull apart. And he could see the writing on the wall. And he was in the worst financial position of his life at that point. His farm had failed. They were in the midst of the first Great American Depression. That's another thing that people don't talk about. they call Grant a failure, and some of them insinuate that it was because he didn't work hard. That's baloney. He worked very hard. In fact, his St. Louis neighbors all criticized him for working right next to his slave. They said, "No, the slaves are supposed to work, not the owners." But he worked right next to him, and he worked so hard that his shoulders began to stoop forward from the heavy loads and from the plowing. And so whenever you read a description of Grant, they always talk about his stooped shoulders. And it was because he worked so hard that his shoulders were like that. But he saw the writing on the wall, and even though at that time he really needed money, he decided that the right thing to do was to set his slave free. And so the year before the Civil War, he could have made $1,000 selling that slave, and he could have used that money. But he set that slave free, and then he swallowed his pride, contacted his father, and said, "I need a job. The farm is not working, and you've got, because his dad now had these leather stores throughout like 4 or 5 states, and he was worth more than $1 million in today's money. So Grant went humbly to his dad and said, "I need a job." And so he had to eat humble pie. Here he was, a captain from the army, had his own farm, but he had to crawl to his dad in a humble way. And his dad put him under his youngest brother in their leather store in Galena, Illinois, which was somewhat humiliating. But Grant worked. He worked the job. He was respectful, but he knew he was biding his time. He knew war was coming, and he knew the North would need generals, and he was preparing to be. He knew he would get a colonel's commission, which is what happened. Exactly that. So he was an amazing person of character, but he certainly paid his dues.
Dr. von Buseck, I knew this would happen. We are out of time. In leaving, I will post again. There is the cover of the book Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. Now we know his real name, or is given his birth name, I guess.
That's right.
And Dr. von Buseck, thank you for sharing with us. We wish you Godspeed and much success in this and all the things that you undertake. And you have blessed us with the richness of the integrity, the character, and the role model that Ulysses S. Grant is for so many of us. And we appreciate you sharing that with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Write another book.
I've got a second one coming in May. So the biography, this one comes out in April, and then in May, there's a companion book called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant.
Okay. All right. Well, folks, we're looking forward to it, and we'll have to talk about that book when it comes out. And we appreciate you sharing with us so generously tonight, Dr. Van Buseck.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure being with you again.
Always. Okay, folks, there you have the view of the Eagle's Nest, the broadcast facilities here at pjnet.tv. We are running behind, but I tell you what, our way here in just a moment. And before I leave, I want to ask you 2 important questions for you to answer to yourself. Here's the first one. What is the boldest thing that you have ever done for Jesus Christ? And second, when was that? I hope none of us will be satisfied with either answer.